Alrighty, so I'll go ahead and get started. This is the invasive plant section, and at first I had listed, you may have seen the agenda, some really common ones, and so I decided to take this a little bit of a different direction in the sense that I wanted to focus on more of the newer species, or maybe the ones that you're less familiar seeing, even though they may be common. So I've moved some species around or changed some species, but still I think it's useful. I'll focus mostly on identification and ecology of them, but we'll touch on management issues as well. But, I always like to start any invasive species talk just by recognizing that we have a mixed history with invasive species in terms of how we've dealt with exotic species and what we've thought about them. And for many, many years, these were desirable species that we intentionally planted for wildlife or for agriculture. And so just understanding that this is a problem in our own making, and really only in the last maybe 30 years have we moved back to understanding the value of really truly native habitats and the damage that these invaders can do. And so we are trying to correct some past wrongs in a way with a lot of these species. And so I collect these little pamphlets from the 50s and the 60s or into the 70s about some of our worst invasive species nowadays. And really any habitat you go in throughout the Southeast, throughout the Eastern United States, it doesn't matter if you're in prairies or forests or wetlands, truly aquatic systems, there's a suite of invasive plants that you have to deal with. They're across the board, and it's something that anybody that works in natural resources or agriculture, it's a reality that this becomes a larger part of your job, is dealing with these invasive plants. And unfortunately, a lot of times it's not just one invasive plant, but we're multiple species that we're trying to address at the same time. But this is a forest health presentation. So what I really wanted to do is focus a little bit before I get into the species just on how invasive plants themselves impact our forest health and the issues we with that. And one of the things is basically our management of our forest and how we manage our forest, and we need to manage them to keep them healthy, keep them productive. Not only does it get a response from our native species that we're trying to manage, but it also can get a response from these invasive species. A lot of our forest management, particularly hardwood forest management, is disturbance-based management, where we're cutting, we're thinning, we're burning to try to promote some species over the others. And those activities, even though they're directed to improving our natives, may impact those invasives. You may get a response from those invasives, whether it's in introducing those invasive species, dispersing their seed, or just causing them to respond positively from that damage. And so invasive species can impact how we can manage, or the cost of management, and then the health of the forest, the results of that management. So I took this shot here at the Ag Center where I work, where we're thinning some trees to try to stimulate our oak regeneration. You see here, we've got a young oak. That's our ideal situation. We want those young oaks, but that same type of management there that we're trying to use to improve our native species can also stimulate invasives. And this is Japanese stilt grass that came in after a canopy damage or an opening in this forest. And I like this shot as well. This was a shot that was after we had a big wind event happened here. And pretty much everything green in the center of this picture is bush honeysuckle. And so it came in aggressively a year or two after some damage events, and really dominated this site. And so it impacted how our species are going to regenerate, what came back after the damage, our native species. And so this kind of is a forest health issue in the sense of keeping a forest healthy and diverse, are these invasives. And then burning is something we do a lot for management, and we know species like Kogan Grass here really responds aggressively following burning too. And so invasive plants are a forest health issue in terms of impacting our trees, but also impacting the whole forest ecosystem. And just before I get into it, a great resource, there's a lot of resources out there. I really like highlighting this one because it covers the major invasive plants in the southern United States. This field guide from Jim Miller and others from the Forest Service. It's a few years old now, but it really covers a lot of good ID pictures in this book. And then there's a companion, a management guide. Both of these are very, very great reference books. And so when you're starting your invasive plant management or you're looking at managing invasives and you want to know about them in the Southeast, these are two books that you should have on your shelf and you should be very familiar with. And thanks to the Bugwood guys down there in Georgia, there's actually a smartphone app for this as well. So that's another way you can get this information. But these invasive species, you know, like I said earlier, they're often intentionally introduced for multiple reasons. They have rapid growth. There's not a lot of our native species will feed on them or keep them in check. They tend to produce a lot of seed and they spread easily, and they like those disturbed areas. So when you're looking for new invasives, oftentimes you're going to look at forest edges, rights of way, disturbed sites, maybe following timber harvest or some kind of damage, areas that were abandoned, old fields. These are the sites often that these invasive plants will first start and show up in a forest. And then they'll move into the rest of the forest following that. So just keep an eye on and look for new things, things that look out of place or something you haven't seen before, particularly if they show up in some of these edge or disturbed habitats. But just jumping in, I've split these up by kind of growth type. And so I'll start with a couple different grass species and then move on from that. And let's hit the big one. That's really a major issue in the Southeast, especially moving east in through South Carolina and North Carolina and definitely Georgia. It's Kogan grass. This species is considered one of the world's worst invasive species. It's estimated that it's invaded over 500 million acres worldwide. It is native to Asia, and now it's found kind of on every continent. It first appeared in the Southeast in the early 1900s, and it was actually trialed for a while and planted as a potential forage crop as well. But then it moved and spread from there, and it's really, really bad in the kind of farther west in the Southeast, so Mississippi, Alabama, Florida. As you get to the true Southeast, the Atlantic coast, it's sporadic in this area, but it's one that we're definitely keeping an eye out on, and it's on the increase. So you can see here, it started really, really got its hold kind of here in southern Alabama and northwestern Florida, and it's been radiating out from there. Really right after Hurricane Katrina, we saw a huge increase in Georgia, and then it's been moving east after that. In terms of how to identify Kogun grass, it's going to flower kind of early or late spring, early summer, April through June. But it doesn't always flower. Many times you'll see infestations that'll they'll spread, they'll be very, very dense growing, but they won't flower. From what I've seen, oftentimes that flowering is stimulated following a burning or following a sudden increase in available light. So I've seen very old stands that don't ever seem to flower. So don't just rely on that. When it does flower, it seems to be a very heavy seed producer, even though there's not a high viability rate, but it produces a ton of seed. If you're looking at just the vegetative components of this plant, it's a fairly broad blade to the grass. They typically have a off-centered whitish midrib on that. Some people mistake it for Johnson grass. It kind of looks like that a little bit. But instead of how Johnson grass has a central stem with the leaves coming off of it, this plant typically has overlapping leaf sheaves that are tight together and go into the ground. So the blades arise really close to the ground with really tightly rolled leaf sheaves. And you can see that, you know, in this picture to the left, but on the picture on the right, you can see it kind of occurs in small bunches. You see there's 1, 2, 3, 4 bunches in a line here. And those usually arise from a big rhizome mat. So the best way, if you think you have Kogun grass, would be to dig it up. And it's going to have this big, dense mat of rhizomes. The rhizomes are segmented, and often the tips of them are pointed and very sharp. So you can see that here with this little rhizome. And that to me is the best way to pick this out. If you're unsure, dig it up, take a look at those root systems. That dense mat will go down several inches, has all those sharp points on it. And if you dig those rhizomes up, again, they're segmented as you see in that picture on the left, but usually they're covered in kind of a papery, flaky scales. And if you peel those scales, they're going to be bright white and broadly segmented underneath of it. When it does invade, oftentimes those dense monocultures will have a circular shape to them. It grows well even in low light environments, although it does not tend to flower. Very fire adapted, it tends to respond positively after fire, and it can handle a lot of drought. Definitely one to keep an eye out on. Again, moving fairly quickly, and one that we're pretty concerned about just because of the level of damage and impact it can do on a site. In terms of management, aggressive tillage, if you do it multiple times and just keep cutting that rhizome mat up, can help. It may not completely remove it. But it is something way to kind of keep it in check. Just again, because it kind of cuts up, exhausts those roots reserves, and you need to really till very deep to get it. In general, you're looking at a chemical management to control this one. There's multiple species that multiple herbicides that seem to be effective. Glyphosate seems to be somewhat effective, and Mazapir is fairly effective at it as well, especially with repeat treatments. Just be careful when you're using a Mazapir because there's some planting restrictions, and you don't want to use it heavily near sensitive species. I know a lot of hardwoods are fairly sensitive to it. Overall, an integrated management technique is best for Kogun grass. Even though burning does stimulate it and it responds positively, the other thing that burning does is remove the thatch, the heavy thatch layer, and stimulates new growth, which is a little more susceptible to the herbicide. So a lot of times what we like to do is burn it, let it come back and get 18, 24 inches tall, and then spray it. And then after that spraying, you can add tillage in there. So it's kind of all of these methods integrated together to control it. And even then, it's going to take a couple years really to kind of get those populations under control. So that's a big one. The next grass species, which is more common, and you may be familiar with it, but maybe not. I find a lot of people, this Japanese stilt grass tends to fly under the radar, and people, even though they have it, are just not as familiar with it. I consider this one probably one of the biggest threats in terms of invasive plants to our hardwood ecosystems throughout the eastern United States. I call it stilt grass. Another name would be brown top or packing grass. This is an unusual grass in that it's an annual warm season shade tolerant grass. And we really don't have many other grasses that fit that category at all. And so it being an annual warm season grass, particularly warm season, means that it's going to do the majority of its growing, it's putting on its biomass in mid to late summer. So that's really when you see this plant take off, but it's shade tolerant, so it's going to grow in the shade, even under fairly heavy forest. And the impacts that we see it in are for our native species that also kind of grow at that same period in time. It tends to prefer moist forests, so bottomlands, bottomland ecosystems, coves, those areas, but I've seen it growing all the way up into the top of dry bluffs. So while it does prefer moist forest, it can grow across the whole landscape. And this one's moved around locally by floodwaters for sure, or animals, deer move it around, things like that. But we spread it as well. Humans spread this one aggressively, accidentally through, mud on people's shoes, equipment, horses, ATVs, anything that can pick up a little bit of mud and move those seeds around is how this plant kind of spreads long distances. It is an annual, and so that's another way to identify it. There's some native grasses that are roughly the same size with similar looking leaves, but they're going to be perennials. This one being an annual, you should grab it and pull it up, and it can just pull right out of the ground. It has an extremely weak root system. It is 1 to 6 feet tall, but it's sprawling in the sense that you'll never see it stand up to 6 feet tall unless it's propped against something. Usually after it gets a foot to 18 inches tall, the weight of the plant itself will kind of cause it to lay over. And so you'll never see it really, really high unless it's balanced or leaning up against something. The leaves are short. They're 2 to 3 inches usually long, maximum, maybe 4 inches, half an inch to 3/4 of an inch wide. So it's a short, wide leaf, especially for a grass. It tends to have a silvery or whitish midrib that may or may not be visible. To me, it looks like a little bamboo almost, where these short little fat leaves on there like that, or almost like a smartweed, actually. It does flower, but it flowers late in the year. So I see it flowering where I'm at late, usually the last week in August through September. So you're looking at early fall is when this flowers. When it does flower, it'll have 2 to 3 little flowering stems on that that are thin, really not very diagnostic, the actual flowering part of it. The leaves, the sprawling stems, and the very, very thin roots are really what you're looking for this one. And here's just a look at some of the different life stages of stilt grass throughout a season. The top left are new germinates. The top right is a stand that's just starting to grow, so this will be early summer. Bottom left is a stand that's just bloomed, so this is late summer, early fall. And then the winter shot with all that thatch is the bottom right. And often that thatch will last throughout winter, and you can see the young plants growing through it the next year. Just another look at it, you can really see the silvery midribs on this picture, and then you can see how the plants just kind of lay over or sprawl. And just a couple more shots. They do tend to call it brown top because when it does start to senesce in the winter or the late fall, it kind of turns a purpley brown on the top of the plant and works its way down that way. And then that picture on the bottom right, you can see those weak, sprawly roots kind of right here. This plant is pretty common, again, throughout much of the east and the southeast, but it's, again, I think it flies under the radar a little bit. Not everybody's familiar with it, so that's why I wanted to include it here. It being an annual plant, your goal for this one is controlling that seed production. The plant's going to die anyway at the end of the season. You just want it to stop producing seed. And so mowing it before seed set is one way to do that. So a late mowing before it starts flowering. Hand pulling is good for small infestations. Prescribed burning tends to promote new growth. So it's something that we've seen higher densities following prescribed burning. There is a chance for growing season burns if you do those kind of very, very early fall, late summer, may be effective at halting that seed production for the year. Overall, we tend to use glyphosate, 2% solution, or even down to 1% solution in water seems to work really well. A lot of times this grows near streams because it likes those moist bottomlands. In that case, you want to make sure you have an aquatic labeled glyphosate. Grass-specific herbicides seem to work pretty well, even at very low rates. And we've actually seen where low rates of grass-specific herbicide will kill the stilt grass and not harm the native perennial grasses. And then we've started looking at some pre-emergent, and this is some data from the last couple of years where we're looking at pre-emergent herbicides to control this. So these would be applied early spring before germination. And we have the percent cover of stilt grass at the end of the growing season versus the percent cover in native vegetation. And we found that Esplanade Sure at 4.5 to 6 ounces per acre applied seems to work really well at controlling the stilt grass while still letting the native species come back. So that's another option, but you make sure you'd want to do that before it germinates in the spring. Alrighty, so those are the two grasses. Again, we're just going to cover several species moving through. Forbs are the next. And another one that's fairly common throughout most of the area that we're talking about today, but I think it flies under the radar a little bit as well, particularly with forest managers. This one is pretty well known in the open or the old fields or those kind of habitats, roadside habitats, but it does have the potential to become a big problem in forest. So that's why I included it here. It's a deep-rooted, semi-woody perennial forb, Sericea lespedeza is. It invades open areas, but really does get into open forest as well. And it tends to be very fire promoted. This one has trifoliate leaves, so small, slender leaflets, three-parted leaves. Overall, it's 3 to 5 feet tall. It'll be fairly straight and a single stem until it gets to the top third of the plant. And then it often branches a bunch right there. So the top of the plants itself will be very, very stemmy, very branchy, and less so as you go down. Flowers midsummer, whitish to yellow flowers, often with a violet center. And when it produces seed, it'll be in a single seed pods. So each pod will have just a single seed in it. And you can see that here, each of these are seed pods with one seed in it. And then you can see the slender leaflets. Now we do have several native Lesbiases. Many of them will have more rounded leaflets. There is one Virginia Lesbiasa that'll have slender leaflets like this. This one tends to have kind of a squared top. Sericea Lesbiasa does, with a little point, and that'll help you identify it from Virginia Lesbiasa, as well as that kind of thick branching nature at the top of the plant. Little white flowers, maybe yellowish. You can see the violet center to them like that. And again, it loves forest edges. It'll start in forest edges, but as a forest thins or you're managing a forest, it'll definitely move into there. It drastically impedes your use of fire as a management tool. You can see here, this is a good shot of the branching nature at the top of the plant, where there's single stems coming up, but in the top third of the plant, it gets really, really stemmy. It branches a lot and it gets really thick there. And that allows it to form these real dense, just heavy layers, monocultures that smothers everything else in the understory. Seeds will live a very, very long time, 30, 40 years sometimes in the soil. So it's very hard to get rid of once you have it. And again, this is widespread. You see this across the whole Southeast. It's common throughout pretty much every county, but it may fly under the radar. It may not be as recognizable to forest managers. So in a forest situation, edges or areas with recent disturbances was where you're going to find this one. In terms of control, Sericea, you know, it's invade all these disturbed habitats, very difficult to eradicate. It has been used in the past for erosion control. We definitely don't recommend that. So instead, we look at burning it to stimulate that, get that new growth, mowing it low, repeated mowings, or triclopyr and fluoxapyr seem to work fairly well as control methods. Again, it's going to take repeated measures for it. It is a bean plant, but we found that those bean-specific herbicides like transline, something like that, don't seem to be very effective on it. So it's repeated measurements or repeated treatments, and then integrating, you know, mowing in there along with herbicide treatments seem to work well, with the understanding that if it's been there for a while, it's well established, you're going to have a seed bank you're going to have to deal with, and so it's going to take repeated treatments multiple years, because you're just going to get some coming back. So the next forb that I really wanted to talk about, and this is one that I would imagine most people are not familiar with. It's more of a true new species, and it's one that has invaded parts of northern Georgia and a lot of the Ohio River Valley, but it's has the ability to spread rapidly, take over. We've seen it actually outcompeting things like stilt grass. So Japanese chafflower is one that we're very worried about, and then very interested in if people are finding this in new areas. It is a perennial in the amaranth family, and it can get big, 3 to 8 feet tall, 8 feet in like ideal growing conditions. It's a habitat generalist. I've seen this growing everywhere from out of the cracks in concrete, on top of bluffs, all the way down to right at the edge of the flood line along streams. It does really like those bottomland forests, but it seems to can grow everywhere. The challenge with chafflower is it looks like everything else in some ways. It's a fairly common looking plant. It does have arching veins on opposite leaves. I'd kind of describe them almost looking like flowering dogwood leaves. The plant itself will have a thickened stem, and the stem will be enlarged at the nodes, and then they'll be reddish. So that's another way. When it does flower, and it flowers late season, so August usually, maybe even into September, it'll have these green petaled bottle brush looking flowers that you see in the picture here. Um, very compact at start, and then as the first flowers that come out start to ripen, those stems will elongate. And over the course of the fall, as it continues to flower and set seed, those stems will get sometimes a foot or more long. When the seeds are produced, the fruit will lay flat against the stem, and it produces these pairs of sharp barbs on that. And that's really how this plant moves around. Those barbs will grab a hold of fur, clothes, anything like that, and kind of hitchhike its way around. So here you can see a plant that's flowering on the left. It's starting to flower. You can see the lower parts of those flowers are already producing seed, and they're starting to lay flat against the stem. The upper parts of the flower are producing new seeds. On the right, here's one that's just at the end of flowering. You can see most of the seeds are produced, and there's just a few flowers on the top. And that's really what it does. It starts as a very, very compact flower and then elongates like that throughout the season. You can see on the left there, those two paired barbs that come from the back of the fruit. And then on the right, again, you see that reddish node as well as the compact flower when it starts flowering. This is a little later as the plant's starting to die back for the year. And you can see just tons and tons and tons of those fully elongated flowering stems, or now seed stems, fruiting stems at the top, just loaded with fruit on that. And so if you walk through this, or an animal walks through this, they'll come out with hundreds of seeds on you. And so that's really the risk of local spread. In terms of where it's found, it was first located in the United States, kind of on the Kentucky, West Virginia border in the Ohio River Valley system. And then it's made its way down the Ohio River, well established now all the way into Arkansas, actually, southern Illinois, lots of Kentucky. But there's a couple disjunct populations, and you see that those spots there in northern Georgia. It's very well established in that area. I'm sure that there's more counties around there that we just don't have it recorded for. But because of its ease of spread, because it has the ability to hitchhike on clothes or hitchhike on fur or dogs, and it tends to be found in along streams, in disturbed areas like campgrounds. It has a big potential to be found anywhere throughout the Southeast. Somebody pick it up and move it. So definitely want to keep an eye out for anywhere you're at. It's probably likely to show up recreation areas, campgrounds, hunter access sites, along waterways. The good thing about chaff flower is that it's fairly easy to kill once you identify it and you have it. Glyphosate, traclopyr, 2,4-D as foliar applications before flowering all have proven very effective at controlling it. The main thing you'd want to do is just identify it early and keep it from getting well established. All right, moving on to one of our invasive vines that we're worried about. So Japanese climbing fern. That is a vine that is really bad farther south, like in northern Florida, getting into southern Georgia, but starting to move throughout the rest of the Southeast. It's one that, since it's spore producing, it can really spread rapidly. We've seen it move in pine straw as well. It's just getting on clothing, and it's microscopic, the spores are, so you're not going to be able to see when you're carrying it around. So it has the potential to move very, very fast. It can climb pretty high up into trees, although I've never seen it at 80 feet. It certainly can get up into the trees. It browns down in the winter, and so that creates a potential for ladder fuels, so it can carry fires into the canopy of trees. And again, spreads rapidly. One of the major pathways for spread of this plant would be pine straw for sure. It is a true fern, even though it's a vine-like fern. And so it'll have underground rhizomes and root systems, and so it'll persist and stay in the system through that. It'll die back to the ground every year and then grow back. But you can see here, these are spore-producing fronds. And each of these spots here will produce a ton of spores. This is one that's starting to get mature and really start to throw a lot of spores like that. To identify it, it's going to be thin, wiry stems, has these heavily dissected leaves or fronds that, and it's a fern. It's obviously a fern, but then it's growing on these long, wiry vines, and it'll wrap itself around trees. You can see the center picture there is the kind of leading edge of the vine where it's starting to grow before the leaves have really fleshed itself out. And on the right is kind of the dying back bit of it. It has been sprayed, but you can see kind of how much vegetation's there and when it dies back. It tends to form these big mats on the ground as it grows over stuff low to the ground or smothers or climbs over small trees or shrubs and forms these dense layers that shades everything out like that. And then again, has this potential to have ladder fuels where it just dies back and creates a lot of dead thatch growing up into the trees. And so it impacts our ability to manage these sites. There's some really big old world climbing fern populations in farther into southern Florida, but this plant has the ability and has moved much more outside of that region and is now kind of throughout the whole coastal plain, moving into the Piedmont area, and is one that we're worried about. There is in some areas, if you're familiar with, actually a native climbing fern that's in the same genus, but its leaves are going to be palmately lobed, and so it'll look kind of like a Virginia creeper or something like that, where it'll have a hand and then lobes on the hands. And it looks quite a bit different. This one is highly dissected, small fronds, and then it's kind of restricted to the southern parts there. But one to keep an eye out for, one that we're concerned about, and it does seem to be kind of moving rapidly throughout much of the southeast. In terms of control, Escort seems to work fairly well as a control. You want to be careful using that, of course, anywhere you're around hardwoods. Glyphosate seems to work well as long as you want to control it. You want to control it early before it starts producing those spores. At that point, it becomes harder and harder to control. Jumping into our next vine, Japanese hops. And this is another one you're probably less familiar with. But I'm seeing more and more of it, and you're seeing it spread throughout much of the eastern United States, and it's one that's becoming more on our radar screen. This is an herbaceous vine. It's an annual vine, so it spreads by seed, and we see it a lot in gravel outwashes, stream sides, sandbars, riparian areas. It likes those wet forest edges. It can move into open forest as well. It has a large seed production and a long germination period, which means it's hard to control early in the season because it'll just germinate new seeds and grow after that. It tends to scramble or climb over native vegetation, climb into trees, and then one of the big ecological impacts is that it kind of grows over these kind of open gravel bar or outwash sites that are ecologically important for nesting birds, and other wildlife that utilize these kind of highly open habitats along streams. This plant can grow over them so quickly that it removes that ecosystem from the landscape. In terms of how to identify Japanese hops, it is palmately lobed, opposite leaves. The entire plant is very rough textured, very scratchy. It's like the rough side of Velcro. So it'll grab onto you. If you rough it, it'll scratch you up. Along the stem, anywhere where leaves come off, there's going to be a pair of downturned bracts along the stem. And that's another way, but the whole plant's scratchy. The stem, the leaves, everything is, as well as those palmately lobed opposite leaves. So here's just a look at one infestation that was growing, sprawling along the ground. And then if you see here, the picture on the left, there's those pair of downturned bracts right where the leaves come off. And you'll see that kind of at every one of these nodes. And that's a good way to identify it. But again, just the palmately lobed leaves, usually there's 5 to 7 lobes. There is a native hops around, and it's typically going to have only 3 lobes. Just some more looks at it there. You can see the leaves. Here it is on the left, climbing up into some trees. It'll get low into trees. I've rarely seen it more than 15, 20 feet. It tends to more sprawl. And then here is it starting to flower. A very, very heavy seed producer. This plant has a sporadic distribution across much of the east, but you can see kind of working its way down into the southeast as well. So definitely one to keep an eye out on. You'd want to look at it for it along waterways, gravel washes, wet ditches, other riparian areas. It seems to be that you would want to, for control, herbicides. You can try to mow it, you can cut it. It would be late season, because early season it's just going to germinate back. But it's difficult sometimes where it grows to get in there to do that. So usually we turn to herbicides. Aquatic safe glyphosate or triclopyr works well midsummer before it starts to flower. Seems to be the best method for this. If you do want to use mechanical control or solarization or something like that, just know that that long germination window that it has is going to require multiple treatments throughout the year. And the last one that I wanted to talk about in terms of new invasive species is one that's the timing is just right because it's flowering right now, at least where I'm at, is Colliery pear. Colliery pear, you may know it by its ornamental names, Bradford pear, Cleveland pear, something like that. The parent species of all those ornamental flowering pears is Colliery pear. And so what happens, those species will cross-pollinate with each other and form fertile seed. And the escapes, the ones that escape out into the wild, they tend to revert back to the Colliery pear, the parent form. So if you're familiar with Bradford pear, that beautiful teardrop shape and all of that, it really loses that largely in the escape versions. It tends to be a scraggly tree, sometimes multi-stemmed. It'll have smaller leaves and it'll actually grow thorns on it at that point. So a lot of times what I've seen is people mistake escaped Colliery pear for plum thickets or something like that because it looks so different in a lot of ways from the ornamental parents. Deciduous small tree, widely planted. It's planted all over the east as an ornamental. It has very little wildlife value, and we're seeing it widely escaped and showing some very aggressive invasive behavior, not only in open areas, but we're having it here in Southern Illinois where I'm at. It's a major issue in tree plantings and young forest where it's just overwhelming the species we're trying to grow in there. In terms of identifying it, it does have alternate simple leaves. The leaves tend to turn deep red to purplish in the fall. It has white flowers, 5 petals. The flowers will often be out early. Again, right now it's blooming. I'm sure it's probably past bloom in the southeast, but it grows early, February, early March. Oftentimes the flowers will start before the leaves come out. The fruit will be after that, a small, rough, kind of marble-shaped fruit with little dots on it, tan in color. The bark is gray, rough bark, but it'll produce some sharp thorns on small branches, but not every individual produces those thorns, but many of them do. The buds are fuzzy, kind of gray to reddish in color as well. And so this is in the summer, what you'll see with a typical escaped Colliery pear, where it's real limby, it's small, branchy, almost multi-stemmed. And then on the right, you can see all those short spurs that grow on it that are ended in a sharp point. So even in the winter, you can pick that out with those short side spurs and the sharp thorns on the end. And at least for me right now, anywhere I drive, you'll see this along the roadsides. Unfortunately, it just seems to be very, very rapidly spreading, moving into open areas, but again, into the forest as well. And in the fall, it'll have that red color. And this is a good example of the top right picture of what an ornamental leaf, a leaf on an ornamental tree looks like. Very round, often wavy, dark green and shiny. The escape versions, the leaves often are much smaller. You see in the bottom picture here, they lose a lot of that shininess or that deep green color. And so a lot of times, like I said, it doesn't even look like the same plant. So a lot of times it just goes away and people assume it's something different. But look for that flowering early, those little tan fruit, marble-sized fruit with the little dots on it, the gray fuzzy buds, and those short side branches that are tipped with a sharp spur. Very, very widespread. It looks like Illinois. Here we're leading the nation in reports, but I can guarantee you it's farther widespread than this map shows. We just need to get more data for it and kind of show where it's at across the whole Southeast. You'll find it invading old fields, invading forests. This is a shot I think that Dr. Coyle here took, but you can see just all of these plants. It seems to rapidly move, rapidly spread. And so far what we've seen, it's all of the ornamental varieties are responsible for contributing to the spread. So there's really not a safe ornamental variety of this species that you can plant that won't have the potential to spread. They all cross-pollinate with each other. They all kind of contribute to fertile seed, especially when they're planted near each other. And now that it's so widespread, the plant doesn't even need the ornamentals, that it's spreading on its own just through escaped individuals reproducing. The one good thing about colliery pear is that it's fairly easy to control. We've done injections, cut stumps, and foliar treatments using triclopyr. All three seem to be very effective. We've done cut stumps and foliar treatments using glyphosate. It also seems to be very effective. So once you get it, kind of your standard woody plant control techniques are going to be effective at controlling it. The main thing, the main challenge is staying ahead of its reproduction and staying ahead of its spread. That is the challenge. Particularly look for this coming in and moving into young tree plantings, old fields, or forest edges. That's where you're going to see this kind of be the most aggressive and do the most damage. And I had to put a picture there of the Bradford pear bounty that Clemson and South Carolina had going on, which was a fantastic educational and management program to get rid of Bradford pears, get rid of these flowering pears as ornamentals and replace them with native species.